She wasn't looking for treasure, just spare parts. When Marley Reyes handed over $200 for an abandoned Cold War-era cargo plane, it felt like just another day in a long line of salvage work. But as she stepped into the dim, rust-streaked fuselage, she found something wedged deep inside the cargo hold sealed boxes that hadn't seen daylight in over 40 years. What started as a side hustle turned into the discovery of a lifetime, one that would test her loyalty, her past, and her trust in everyone she knew. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this make your gears turn, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode takes this mystery even further. You won't want to miss it. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the abandoned airstrip. Marley Reyes stood on cracked asphalt, a rusted toolbox in one hand and a faded receipt in the other. The plane before her, a Cold War-era cargo jet, was a far cry from the pristine machines she usually worked on. It was covered in patches of peeling paint, dents that seemed to tell 1,000 stories, and a fuselage that looked like it hadn't flown in decades. But to Marley, it was the perfect find. The owner, a local who'd inherited the abandoned property, had all but begged her to take the plane. "It's yours for $200, lady," he'd said. "I've got no use for it. Maybe you can sell the parts, scrap the rest. Hell, I don't even know why I'm holding on to it." Marley had smiled. People didn't understand her the way she saw potential in things that others discarded. This wasn't just a chunk of old metal. It was a challenge. And a challenge was exactly what she needed. The rusted plane was parked off to the side of a deserted runway, its cargo hold wide open like a gaping mouth waiting to swallow whatever Marley could throw at it. She ran a hand over the cold steel of the fuselage, the rough texture of rust under her fingers. The smell of oil, old fuel, and dirt filled the air. It wasn't glamorous, but for Marley, it was home. She didn't hesitate. She dropped her bag and opened the door, the creak of metal sounding like a warning. Inside, the cargo hold was dark, save for a few streaks of light filtering through cracked windows. Marley flicked on her flashlight, the beam illuminating the cavernous space. Dust danced in the air like ghosts, and the remnants of a life long gone stared back at her. But as she stepped further in, she noticed something out of place. Amidst the broken crates and twisted metal, Marley spotted a stack of sealed boxes wedged into a corner, their edges hidden under layers of forgotten debris. Curiosity prickled at the back of her neck. Why hadn't anyone noticed these before? She knelt down, brushing aside cobwebs and dirt. The boxes weren't marked with any logos, but there was something about them that felt important. With a sharp tug, Marley pulled the first box free, feeling the weight of it in her hands. It wasn't the weight of metal or scrap. This box felt like something more. She wiped away the grime to reveal an old, rusted lock. The anticipation in her chest grew. Slowly, she unclipped it, hearing the faint click as the lock gave way. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in thick layers of brown paper, were stacks of bills, hundreds of them. She could barely catch her breath. "What the hell is this?" she whispered to no one in particular. It didn't make sense. Why would anyone hide money in a plane like this? But the more she pulled out, the clearer it became. Bundles of cash, all of it old, all of it pristine. She pulled back the layers. There was more. Letters, photographs, official-looking documents. But the money was what caught her attention. Marley's mind raced. $200 for a plane full of millions in cash? It was too good to be true. And that's when the weight of her discovery hit her. This wasn't just about the plane anymore. This was something bigger. She had to figure out who put it there, why, and if there were any more secrets hidden in the dark corners of this rusted giant. The only thing she knew for sure was that her life was about to change forever. And as the last of the sunlight faded, Marley felt a chill in the air, as if something, or someone, was watching her every move. The day after Marley's discovery, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The money was piled neatly inside those boxes, But there was an unease deep in her gut, a sense that this wasn't just some forgotten stash of old bills. She had spent the whole night sifting through the bundles, unable to tear her eyes away from the crisp, aged cash. It wasn't just the quantity of it that disturbed her, it was the precision. Every bill, every stack, looked too pristine for something hidden away for so long. But what really gnawed at her was the moment when she uncovered the first photograph. It was a Polaroid, faded with age. The edges were dog-eared, the color muted, but the image was clear enough. A group of men, standing around a cargo plane identical to the one she had just purchased. They were wearing old military-style uniforms, faces obscured by shadows. But one man stood out. He was older, maybe in his 52nd, with sharp eyes and a hard jawline. There was something about his presence that made Marley's skin crawl. She flipped the photograph over, half expecting it to be blank. But there, in faint blue ink, was a name. H. Richter. It didn't mean anything to her. At least, not yet. Marley ran her fingers across the paper, turning the photo over and over, as if the image might somehow change. But nothing did. She reached into the crate again, pulling out a series of letters, some handwritten, others typed. The letters were dated back to the 1970 seconds, each one filled with formal language and cryptic phrases. They spoke of meetings, trades, and business transactions, all surrounding a mysterious shipment. The more she read, the more the story began to take shape. But it wasn't until she came across a final document that things started to click. It was an official-looking record. A receipt of sorts, stamped with the seal of what appeared to be a government agency, detailing the transport of the plane. It was signed by none other than H. Richter. Marley's heart skipped. Shipment. Restricted goods. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Restricted goods? She scanned the page, reading through the formal legal jargon, but it didn't help much. Whatever was being transported on that plane all those years ago was hidden from the public, protected, locked away. She had stumbled across something far more dangerous than she'd first imagined. With trembling hands, Marley placed the receipt down and took a step back. The plane had been sitting there, abandoned, for nearly 40 years. No one had come for it. No one had come for the money. But now, the more she looked at the documents and photographs, the more it seemed like someone had gone to great lengths to keep this secret. Her mind raced. The discovery felt too easy, like it was handed to her on a silver platter. Maybe it was, or maybe she was just being paranoid. But then, a faint sound interrupted her thoughts. A voice, distant but clear, shouting her name. Marley. She froze, her blood running cold. It was too late to hide everything, too late to run. The danger wasn't just in the past anymore. The past was knocking on her door, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. But she had no choice. With a final glance at the boxes and their secrets, Marley took a deep breath. She had to figure out who these people were, what H. Richter had to do with it all, and most importantly, why this plane was abandoned with so many unanswered questions. As she stepped out of the plane and onto the cracked concrete of the airstrip, the sound of footsteps approached, quickening her pulse. Whoever it was, they were closing in fast. "Marley!" the voice shouted again. She turned, already knowing who it was. Her old friend Eddie was walking toward her, his expression tense, eyes scanning the area. "You found it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. Marley didn't respond right away. Eddie had been her go-to guy for years when it came to heavy lifting, mechanical work, and tracking down rare parts. But something about his presence now felt different, colder. She could see the faint glint of greed in his eyes. "Found what?" she asked, pretending ignorance, though she knew exactly what he was talking about. Eddie paused, a smirk creeping onto his face. "Come on, Marley. We both know that plane wasn't just sitting there for nothing. You found something valuable, didn't you?" His voice was smooth, almost too smooth. Marley narrowed her eyes. "Whatever it is, I'm not interested in selling," she said, stepping back. Eddie's smirk faltered, and for a moment, the tension between them thickened. "You sure about that?" he asked. "Because I'm pretty sure you don't know what you're holding on to. And I do. All you need to do is hand it over. I'll make it worth your while." Something in Marley snapped. She wasn't going to let this slide. She wasn't some fool who could be bought. Without saying another word, she turned on her heel and walked away, feeling Eddie's eyes on her every step. She had to figure this out on her own. The mystery of H. Richter, the money, the cargo, it was only just beginning. And the more she uncovered, the more dangerous this game would become. The morning after Eddie's visit, Marley couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a dangerous mistake. She didn't trust Eddie, not completely, but there was something about his presence that lingered. His words had been more than just a casual suggestion. They were a warning that someone else, someone with power, was watching her. Back at her workshop, Marley tried to focus on the work at hand, but the cargo hold of the plane kept creeping back into her thoughts. The boxes, the money, the strange connection to H. Richter, it was all too much to ignore. She couldn't just leave it there. Her mind raced as she walked over to the table where she had spread out the documents, photographs, and receipts. She wasn't just going to sit around and wait for someone else to figure it out. She had to dig deeper. The letters she had found in the crates were cryptic, filled with official-sounding language that made her head spin. But one thing was clear. They were talking about something much bigger than money. There were references to black operations, covert shipments, and highly classified personnel. Whatever HNDA Richter had been involved in, it wasn't just about stashing cash in an old plane. It was a part of something far more dangerous. She picked up the photo again, her eyes tracing the faces of the men surrounding the plane. The man she had noticed before, the one who seemed to exude authority, was standing near the front, his arms crossed and gaze unwavering. H. Richter. Marley could feel her pulse quicken as she stared at him, the name on the back of the photo now etched in her mind. She had to know who he was. Marley spent the next few hours combing through public records, cross-referencing names, and searching for any sign of H. Richter. But it was like the man didn't exist. There were no photos, no birth records, no obvious connections to anything or anyone. It was as if he was a ghost. But Marley wasn't giving up that easily. She was a mechanic, yes, but she was also someone who had spent years chasing down pieces of information that didn't want to be found. She knew how to read people, how to understand the subtle clues others missed. Her breakthrough came when she found a mention of H. Richter in a classified government report, buried deep in an online archive. The document itself was heavily redacted, but there was a date, a specific year, that made her freeze. 1973. That year wasn't just random. It was the same year that the cargo plane had been grounded. The coincidence was too much to ignore. But what really made her stomach drop was what she found under the redacted section. It mentioned a special cargo assignment, something involving a top-secret operation. Marley's hands shook as she typed in the name of the operation, praying it would lead somewhere. The result was far worse than she could have imagined. Project Midnight. The search results returned an avalanche of information. Covert military operations, government contractors, and a network of high-ranking officials involved in something so clandestine that Marley could hardly believe it. Project Midnight was the code name for a black market operation involving the transport of highly sensitive and often illegal goods, including weapons, rare materials, and people. Marley's stomach churned. Was this what the cargo plane had been used for? Had she just stumbled upon a piece of history that had been buried for decades? The money, the photos, the letters, they were all connected to this operation. But why had it been abandoned? A sudden thought hit her like a ton of bricks. What if H. Richter wasn't just a government agent? What if he was part of something even darker? She needed answers. But the more Marley pieced together the puzzle, the more dangerous it became. Whoever had been involved in Project Midnight wasn't just going to let this information slip away, and if there was one thing she knew for sure now, it was that she had become part of the equation. Marley wasn't sure who to trust anymore. She couldn't even trust Eddie. He had been too eager to get his hands on the plane's contents. But there was someone else she could turn to. Lucia. Lucia was an old friend from her mechanic days. A former military officer who had contacts in places most people couldn't even imagine. Lucia had always been there when Marley needed a second opinion, a different perspective, or just someone who wasn't afraid to ask tough questions. If anyone could help her make sense of all this, it was Lucia. Grabbing her jacket and the stack of documents, Marley set out to find her. There was no time to waste. As the sun dipped low in the sky, Marley's mind raced. The stakes were getting higher with every passing minute. She was no longer just a mechanic. She was a woman holding on to a secret so big, so dangerous, that it could bring down everything she knew, and there was no turning back now. The drive to Lucia's place felt like it took longer than usual. Marley's mind was racing, replaying the details of the documents she had uncovered. Project Midnight, the secret operation, the name H. Richter. Everything she had learned felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit yet, and the more she thought about it, the more dangerous the situation became. She wasn't just dealing with some shady government operation anymore. Whoever was behind it was still out there, and they wouldn't be happy to know that she'd stumbled upon their secrets. Lucia's place was a few miles outside town, nestled in the woods. It had always been a quiet refuge for the both of them, a place where they could get away from the noise and the grind of their day-to-day lives. Lucia had left the military years ago, and since then, she'd built a new life as a private contractor, but she still kept in touch with her old network. If anyone knew how to dig deeper into something this dangerous, it was Lucia. Marley pulled up to the cabin, the headlights cutting through the thick forest. Lucia was waiting outside, leaning casually against the doorframe, arms folded. Her short-cropped hair framed a face that was always calm, cool, and calculating. A woman who had seen it all. "Thought you might be coming," Lucia said, giving her a small nod. She didn't ask any questions. She never did. Marley stepped out of the truck, the cool air biting at her skin. "You've got to see this," she said, tossing the stack of documents on the hood. "It's worse than I thought." Lucia didn't touch the papers. Instead, she glanced at Marley, her eyes narrowing with a look of cautious curiosity. "You've already poked the hornet's nest, haven't you?" Marley paused. "Yeah, I think I have." Without another word, Lucia led her inside. The cabin was sparse but well-equipped, a reflection of Lucia's no-nonsense attitude. There was a faint smell of coffee in the air, and the low hum of a television set filled the silence. Lucia motioned for Marley to sit at the small table in the corner. She did so, watching as Lucia started a pot of coffee. "This Project Midnight thing? You're sure it's real?" Lucia asked, her back to Marley as she worked. "Too real," Marley replied. "The government was involved, but it's bigger than that. H. Richter, this guy, he's at the center of it all. I found records, receipts, even a damn black market operation." She leaned forward, her voice dropping low. "But here's the kicker: the plane I bought? It's not just some junk. That cargo hold was used for transporting illegal stuff. Weapons, people, who knows what else." Lucia set the coffee pot down, her eyes darkening. She had always been good at hiding her emotions, but Marley could see the tension in the lines of her face. "And you're just sitting on this? No one else knows?" Marley shook her head. "Not yet. But Eddie, he knows something's up. He's sniffing around. He's got connections, and I don't trust him." Lucia's lips twitched into a small smile. "I wouldn't trust him either. But what's the plan then?" "I need to know more about H. Richter. He's the key. But whoever he was working with, they're not going to let this slide. I can already feel them closing in. I'm not waiting around to find out who's knocking at my door." Lucia's expression softened, just a fraction. She knew Marley better than anyone. The same determination that had gotten her into this mess was the same fire that would get her out of it. "I can help. I have some contacts. They're not pretty, but they're good at getting answers." Marley nodded, grateful for Lucia's unwavering support. She needed her more than she'd realized, but just as she opened her mouth to say something, a faint knock echoed through the cabin. Lucia froze, her eyes darting to the door. Marley's pulse quickened. That wasn't the knock of someone who knew Lucia. It was quick, deliberate, urgent. Lucia stood up, her chair scraping the floor. Without a word, she moved toward the door. "Stay here," she said quietly. Marley didn't argue. She just watched as Lucia slipped behind the door, peering through a small crack in the wood. She could hear the low murmur of conversation, the faint sound of shoes on gravel outside. A voice broke the tension. It was deep, low, and unmistakable. "Lucia, we need to talk." Marley's heart dropped into her stomach. That voice, she recognized it immediately. Eddie. Marley's mind raced. He was here. He had found them. Lucia's hand tightened around the door handle. "Not now, Eddie. You're too late." There was a pause. Then Eddie's voice grew more insistent, more dangerous. "You don't understand. This isn't just about some old plane anymore. We're talking about the network. And you're both in it now. You don't get to walk away." The air in the room seemed to thicken, the weight of his words settling around them. Lucia didn't respond, but Marley could see the tension in her shoulders. The fight was far from over. Lucia turned to Marley, her eyes hard. "Get ready. We're not alone anymore." The night was still, broken only by the sound of wind rustling through the trees outside Lucia's cabin. Marley sat at the table, hands clenched into fists, trying to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in her head. Eddie's visit had left an unsettling mark on the evening. His warning about the network, the shadowy group behind the operation, had made her realize just how far this tangled web went. She wasn't dealing with petty criminals anymore. This was something much bigger, and that meant she needed to be careful. Lucia hadn't said a word since Eddie left, just handed Marley a fresh cup of coffee and sat down opposite her. The silence between them felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. Marley had learned long ago that Lucia didn't need to speak to communicate. Her silence now was her way of telling Marley to think, to weigh her options carefully. "Whatever you're thinking, don't do it alone," Lucia said, finally breaking the quiet. "This is bigger than both of us, and Eddie's not the only one who knows about the plane." Marley met her gaze. "I know. That's why I came to you. I need answers." Lucia took a sip from her own mug, watching Marley closely. "You're not going to like them." Before Marley could respond, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was different, slower, deliberate. Marley's body tensed. She glanced at Lucia, who nodded toward the door, signaling her to stay quiet. Lucia stood and moved quietly toward the door. She peered out through the peephole. "It's him." "Eddie?" Marley asked, her voice tight. Lucia shook her head. "No, someone else." She paused, then opened the door just a crack. A tall figure stood on the other side, his silhouette shadowed by the porch light. The man was impeccably dressed. A sharp suit, crisp tie. The kind of man who could blend into any crowd and still make an impression. His face was obscured by a dark fedora, but there was no mistaking the authority in his stance. "I know you're in there, Lucia." The man's voice was smooth, calm, almost calculated. "And I know what you've been helping with." Lucia didn't flinch. "I told you to stay away." "I'm not here to argue," the man said. "I'm here to make you an offer." Marley stood, heart racing. She didn't know what this was, but it couldn't be good. The man stepped forward, pushing the door open just enough to show his face. He was older than she'd expected, with a sharp, angular face and eyes that were cold as ice. He didn't need to introduce himself. The air around him screamed power. "I'm Agent Holt," he said, his voice dripping with authority. "I'm not with the government, not exactly. But I am with someone who has a vested interest in your recent discoveries." Marley felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew exactly where this was headed. She had already seen the type before, men like him who operated in the shadows, who wielded information like a weapon. "You've been poking around in things you don't understand," Agent Holt continued, stepping closer. "But I'm not here to make you a target. I'm here to offer you a deal." "A deal?" Lucia repeated. "You've got to be kidding me." Holt's eyes flicked to Marley, his gaze calculating. "You found something in that plane, didn't you?" he asked, his tone turning more personal. The money, the documents, you're in way over your head now, and it's too late to turn back. Marley stood still, resisting the urge to step back. And what's the deal? She asked. Simple. Holt smiled, but it was more of a thin, dangerous smile than anything friendly. You hand over everything you've found, all the documents, the money, and the plane itself. We'll make sure you and your little shop stay off the radar. We'll make sure no one comes looking for you. You'll get to walk away clean, no questions asked. The offer hung in the air, too tempting to ignore, yet too sinister to accept. Marley thought about what Holt was offering. Safety, freedom, the chance to walk away from this nightmare and return to her quiet life. But something inside her rebelled at the idea. This wasn't just about a plane anymore. It wasn't about money or deals. It was about the truth. What if I don't take the deal? Marley asked, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Holt's smile faded slightly, his gaze hardening. Then you become a liability. And we don't keep liabilities. Lucia stepped forward, her jaw set. You've made your point, Holt. Now get out of here before we make things difficult. Holt didn't flinch. He knew they couldn't stop him, but his eyes flicked briefly to Marley, and the threat in his gaze was clear. This isn't over, he said, turning toward the door. But remember, I'm offering you a chance to get out. Don't make me regret it. He turned and left as silently as he had arrived, the door clicking shut behind him. Marley stood there for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. That's it then, Marley said softly. There's no going back. Lucia didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the door, her mind working. Finally, she spoke. You could take the deal. It might save you a lot of trouble. Marley shook her head. No, I didn't come this far just to walk away. Lucia's eyes softened, just for a moment. Then we're in this together. Marley nodded. We'll find out who H. Richter really was, and why this plane was left behind. But we do it on our terms. The night had grown colder, and the weight of what lay ahead hung in the air. But Marley knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back now. The days after Holt's visit were filled with a heavy silence that hung over the cabin like a dark cloud. Marley couldn't shake the offer he'd given her, or the cold, calculated look in his eyes. A part of her wanted to walk away to take the deal and disappear back into the life she knew, but she couldn't. The secrets of the cargo plane, the connection to H. Richter, and the strange, terrifying world she'd uncovered were too big, too important to ignore. Lucia had kept her distance since the meeting with Holt. There were no easy words to say, no quick solutions. They both knew that any decision now would come with consequences. It was late afternoon when the call came. Marley was standing by the plane, running her hands along the edge of the fuselage, the quiet hum of the engine in the distance. She had been preparing to strip it down for parts, trying to stay focused on the one thing she could control. But the sound of her phone vibrating in her pocket pulled her back to reality. The caller ID flashed with a name she didn't recognize. It was a local number, unfamiliar but somehow familiar enough to feel like a warning. Marley hesitated, but answered. Marley, the voice on the other end said, smooth and cold, like ice gliding over steel. You're making a mistake. Her heart skipped. Who is this? A brief pause. It's Eddie. I think you know who I am. Marley's stomach tightened. Eddie. She had been expecting him, but not like this. What do you want? She asked, keeping her voice steady. I want you to stop digging. Stop looking into Project Midnight. I'm not asking. Eddie's tone had changed. It was no longer just a friendly warning. It was a threat, and it was more dangerous than anything she had felt before. Eddie, I don't have time for games. Marley was trying to keep calm, but her mind was racing. She knew he had connections, but this felt different. It wasn't just a random call. It was part of something much bigger. I'm not playing games, Marley. You've already stepped into something you don't understand. H. Richter was part of something that's much bigger than you and me. This whole thing, it goes way beyond your little plane. Marley's pulse quickened. What do you mean? What's going on, Eddie? I'm trying to help you, Eddie said, his voice quieter now. I told you, we're on the same side. But the people you're dealing with, they won't let you go. Not without consequences. And if you keep going, you're going to make it worse for both of us. I'm not backing down, Marley said, her voice firm. Not now. Not after everything I've uncovered. Eddie's voice shifted again, this time tinged with a coldness she hadn't heard before. Then you're a fool. Before she could respond, the line went dead. Marley stood frozen for a moment, the weight of Eddie's words hanging in the air. She had suspected for some time that he wasn't just a mechanic's helper. There was more to him, much more. But she hadn't expected him to turn on her like this, to threaten her. And yet, the reality was clear. Eddie wasn't just trying to protect her, he was protecting someone or something else. She didn't have time to process it. Not now. The truth was, Eddie's betrayal was only the beginning. She had known people would come for the information she'd uncovered, but hearing it from Eddie made it real. He was part of the web, and that meant it was tangled deeper than she'd ever imagined. It wasn't just about the plane anymore. It was about power, control, and a dangerous network that had been operating in the shadows for decades. She turned back to the plane, the metal reflecting the setting sun as a new resolve settled in her chest. She was in too deep to back out now, but she had to move fast. At that moment, she heard the familiar sound of tires crunching on gravel. Her heart skipped. A car was pulling up to the hangar, the engine humming as it came to a stop. Marley rushed to the side of the plane, heart racing. She needed to get inside, to figure out who was out there. She grabbed a wrench off the workbench, her grip tight as she hid in the shadows, waiting. The footsteps outside grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, they were coming for her. And she was ready. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was Lucia. Someone's looking for you, Lucia said quietly, her face serious. And I don't think they're here to talk. Marley's breath caught in her throat. She knew exactly who Lucia meant. The betrayal had begun, but this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something far worse. The wind howled outside as Marley stepped carefully across the cold concrete of the hangar. Lucia's presence was a steadying force, but the tension in the air was palpable. The footsteps outside had stopped, but the unsettling feeling that someone was always watching lingered. Lucia had insisted they move quickly, and Marley trusted her instincts. The longer we stay here, the more chance we give someone to find us, Lucia had said earlier. Marley knew she was right. The risk was too great, but the truth was even greater. If they didn't act now, they'd lose the chance to expose everything. We're going to get answers, but we have to leave. Now, Lucia said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. She grabbed Marley's wrist firmly, pulling her away from the plane. What's the plan? Marley asked, voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. She had to stay focused. She had to push forward. There's a contact I know. He's off the grid, but he has information about Project Midnight. He might know more about Richter and where this all leads, Lucia explained, her eyes scanning the shadows as they moved. But it's a risk. This guy doesn't deal in the open. They made their way to Lucia's truck, the engine roaring to life, as Marley settled into the passenger seat. The road ahead was dark, the landscape a blur as they headed out of town, leaving everything behind: the shop, the plane, and the threats that followed them. There was no turning back now. As the miles passed, the quiet between them settled into a comfortable rhythm. It wasn't until they reached the outskirts of the city that Marley spoke again. Do you think Eddie was right? She asked quietly. Should I have taken Holt's deal? Should we just walk away? Lucia's grip tightened on the wheel, but her gaze remained fixed on the road. I don't know, Marley. But what I do know is that once you start down this road, you don't get to decide when you stop. Eddie's right about one thing: we're in this now. But we're not backing down. Not unless we get what we need. The city lights began to fade, replaced by the pitch black of the country roads. The eerie silence of the night wrapped around them like a blanket, thick with the weight of unspoken words. Marley knew the risks, knew the danger that awaited them. But something deeper was pushing her forward, a need for answers, for closure, for a future that didn't feel dictated by the past. The truck slowed as they approached a small, rundown farmhouse, the kind of place you'd pass by without a second glance. But as Lucia drove up the dirt driveway, Marley could see the faint outline of a figure waiting near the porch. A man, tall and wiry, wearing a weathered jacket that had seen better days. "This is it," Lucia muttered, her voice low. "Stay close." They stepped out of the truck, the crunch of gravel beneath their boots loud in the stillness. The man stepped forward as they approached, his eyes flicking between the two of them. He had the look of someone who'd spent years on the run, someone who didn't ask questions unless he was ready for the answers. "Lucia," he said with a nod. "You're late. Had to make sure we weren't followed," Lucia replied, her voice tight. "This is Marley. She's the one I told you about." The man's eyes shifted to Marley, and he gave her a hard, unreadable stare. "I've heard of you, but I don't know if that's a good thing." He stepped aside, motioning for them to follow him into the house. The air inside was thick with dust, and the smell of something old, something forgotten. The walls were lined with shelves filled with strange artifacts and documents, a mix of chaos and order. At the center of the room, a table sat covered in maps, files, and photographs. It looked like a war room, and Marley was the unwitting soldier. "You've come to the right place," the man said, motioning to the table. "But the truth, Miss Reyes, isn't always as clean as you think it is." Marley exchanged a glance with Lucia before stepping forward. "What do you know about H. Richter? About Project Midnight?" The man's face grew serious. "More than you'll want to hear. But if you're going to survive what's coming, you'll need to know everything. H. Richter's involvement in this goes deeper than you realize, and you're not the only one who's looking for the answers." Marley's stomach tightened. "Who else is involved?" The man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "People who can make you disappear without a trace. People who don't ask questions because they already know the answers." Lucia stepped forward. "What's our move?" The man's eyes flicked to the maps. "We go in. We take what we can, find Richter's hidden files, and get out before they even know we were here. It's risky, but it's the only shot you've got." Marley felt her heart pound in her chest. It was a plan born from desperation, a plan that would pull them into the heart of a dangerous conspiracy. But she had no other choice. The truth was out there, buried in those files, and she would do whatever it took to find it. "Then let's do it," Marley said, her voice steady, despite the fear creeping in. "Let's find H. Richter. Let's find the truth." The farmhouse was eerily quiet, as the man who had introduced himself simply as Jackson led Marley and Lucia deeper into his cluttered war room. He'd set them up at a makeshift table surrounded by stacks of documents, the room heavy with the scent of old paper and the sharp tang of cigarettes. Jackson's fingers flicked through a pile of files, each one older than the last, before finally stopping at a thick folder with no label. "This is what you came for," he said, sliding the folder toward Marley. The weight of it was unsettling, its contents seeming more like a grave secret than a series of papers. Marley's heart beat faster as she reached for the folder. She flipped it open, scanning through pages of classified reports, encrypted messages, and photos. The first few pages were mostly redacted, but the deeper she went, the clearer the picture became. Project Midnight wasn't just a covert operation. It was the skeleton of an international network that had been operating in the shadows for over 30 years. H. Richter wasn't just a government agent. He had been a key player in the operation, but it went far beyond him. The files detailed how Project Midnight had been designed to transport high-value, often illegal, assets around the world. Weapons, rare materials, even people all moved through a network of agents, covert military contractors, and shadow organizations that had remained invisible to the public eye. But the most shocking revelation came when Marley reached the final pages of the file. A photo, this time of H. Richter, stood out among the others. He was much younger, A man with a face full of ambition and secrets, standing beside an older man who looked vaguely familiar to Marley, her father. Her breath caught in her throat. This was no coincidence. H. Richter. He worked with my father, Marley whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. But why? What was my father involved in? Jackson leaned back, his eyes hardening. Your father was a part of this, yes. But he wasn't just another player. He was one of the key architects of the network. Project Midnight didn't just transport weapons. It also facilitated high-level government operations, some of them connected to your father's work in aviation. The plane you found? It was part of a bigger plan. Marley's mind reeled. She had always known her father's work was shrouded in mystery, but she never imagined it was tied to something so dangerous. The idea that her father had been involved in a covert operation, one with a legacy like Project Midnight, made her feel sick. She had spent her life trying to distance herself from his shadow, and now she was standing in the very heart of it. But what happened to him? Marley demanded, looking up at Jackson. Why was he never around when I needed him? Why didn't he ever tell me any of this? Jackson's face softened, but there was a trace of pity in his eyes. Your father disappeared when the operation started to fall apart. Something went wrong, and Richter and the others needed to cover their tracks. They couldn't afford to let anyone know what was really going on, especially someone like you, your father. He made choices that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Marley slammed the folder shut, a wave of anger and grief crashing over her. So he just abandoned me, left me to clean up his mess. No, Jackson said quietly. He didn't leave you. He tried to protect you. But when it all came crashing down, he had to make a choice. And the price was his life, or at least his freedom. Marley turned away, trying to fight the lump in her throat. I don't know if I can do this, she said, her voice trembling. I can't be part of this anymore. I thought I was just fixing a plane. I never asked for any of this. Lucia placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a silent strength. You've already come too far. You can't walk away now. Marley wiped her eyes, taking a deep breath. The pain in her chest was almost too much to bear, but she couldn't let it control her. She had come for the truth, and now she had it. Her father's legacy was tied to a conspiracy that spanned decades, and she wasn't about to walk away from it. Where do we go from here? Marley asked, turning to Jackson. Jackson's eyes darkened. There's a safe house in the city where we can get more information. Richter's files are hidden in multiple locations, but they're all connected. If you want to know the full extent of what your father was involved in, you'll need to find the final piece. That's where we need to go. Marley nodded. Then let's get it. The weight of the truth hung over her. But Marley felt a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that this was the moment that would define everything. She couldn't undo the past, but she could make sure that her father's legacy didn't continue in the shadows. She would find the answers, and she would expose the network that had ruined so many lives, including her own. The night was heavy with tension as Marley, Lucia, and Jackson made their way to the safe house. The city was a maze of dark alleyways and neon signs, the usual buzz of activity muted by the weight of their mission. Marley's mind churned, still reeling from the truth she had uncovered about her father, about Richter, and the entire operation that had run beneath the surface of her life like a quiet poison. It was clear now that there was no going back, but as they navigated the winding streets, Marley couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, her senses heightened. She had trusted Jackson, but how could she be sure? How did she know he wasn't just another player in the game? How much farther? Marley asked, trying to steady her breathing. Not far, Jackson replied, his voice low and tight. Just a few more blocks. Marley glanced at Lucia, who walked a few steps ahead, her gaze sharp, always alert. The trust between the two of them had been built over years of shared history. But even Lucia wasn't immune to doubt. They had no way of knowing if Jackson was truly on their side, if anyone was. Every move they made, every step forward, felt like they were walking on a razor's edge. Suddenly, Marley's phone buzzed in her pocket, the vibration making her jump. She pulled it out, her heart sinking as she saw the name on the screen. Eddie. She hesitated for only a second before answering, the weight of his betrayal still fresh in her mind. Marley. Eddie's voice crackled over the line, filled with urgency. You need to listen to me. I didn't want to do this, but I had no choice. Jackson isn't who he says he is. Marley's pulse shot through her chest. What the hell are you talking about? I'm telling you, Marley. He's working with them. He's been feeding you false information. The moment you leave the city, you're walking into a trap. There are people looking for you, and Jackson's one of them. Marley's breath caught in her throat. You're lying. I wish I was, Eddie said, his voice grim. I'm trying to protect you, but I can't do it alone. You need to get out of there. Now. The call ended abruptly, leaving Marley standing in the dim light of the street, 1,000 thoughts racing through her mind. Eddie's words hung in the air like poison, each syllable wrapping itself around her throat. Could it be true? Could Jackson really be a part of the operation, working for the same people who had tried to silence her? Marley, what's wrong? Lucia asked, her eyes narrowing in concern. Marley didn't answer at first. Her hands were shaking, but she managed to steady herself. She couldn't let the fear take over. Not now. Eddie just called, she said, her voice low, controlled. He says Jackson's working with them, the same people who've been after us. He says he's been feeding us lies. Lucia's expression hardened, but there was no surprise in her eyes. She had seen enough betrayal in her lifetime to know that trust was a fragile thing. I had a feeling something wasn't right, but I didn't want to say it. You think Eddie's telling the truth? Marley asked, though she already knew the answer. She had no way of knowing who to trust anymore. But Eddie's sudden call, his frantic warning, couldn't be ignored. Either way, we can't afford to trust anyone right now, Lucia said, her voice cold and calculating. We have to assume that Jackson is lying to us, and make sure he doesn't get the chance to finish whatever he started. Marley nodded. The world had become a far more dangerous place in the span of just a few hours. Everything she had worked for, the truths she had uncovered, the pieces of the puzzle she had put together, all of it was starting to feel like quicksand. The deeper she dug, the more it sucked her in. As they neared the safe house, Marley's stomach twisted with anxiety. There was no way to know if Jackson was already preparing to betray them, or if they were walking into a trap. They had to make it to the safe house first, and then figure out their next move. The door to the safe house creaked open, and Jackson stepped inside, his silhouette framed by the dim light behind him. He didn't seem nervous. He didn't seem to care that their lives were hanging by a thread. His demeanor was cool, almost too cool. Come in, both of you, Jackson said, his voice neutral. We don't have much time. Marley exchanged a look with Lucia. The moment of truth had arrived. They stepped inside cautiously, eyes darting around the room as they followed Jackson deeper into the small building. There were maps pinned to the walls, photos of various locations, some familiar, some not, and an array of computers and monitors that seemed far too high-tech for a place like this. Everything you need is in here, Jackson said, motioning to the monitors. You'll find all the information you need about Richter, about Project Midnight. All the files you need are stored on these servers. This is where you finish this. Marley's heart hammered in her chest as she walked toward the desk, her fingers brushing the surface of the computer. Every instinct she had screamed that something was wrong, that this was all a setup. But she couldn't stop now. She couldn't let fear stop her from seeing this through to the end. Lucia leaned over and whispered, "We need to be ready. If this is a trap, we'll make sure we don't get caught in it." Marley nodded, determination flooding her veins. They had come this far. They couldn't let anything or anyone stand in their way. But one thing was clear. Trust no one. The room was silent, except for the hum of the computers, the soft glow of the monitors casting shadows across Marley's face. She sat in front of the desk, fingers poised over the keyboard, ready to dive deeper into the information Jackson had promised. Every instinct told her to be cautious, to question every move she made. But there was no turning back now. She had to know the truth not just about Project Midnight, but about the people who had played her, used her, and betrayed her. Behind her, Lucia kept a watchful eye on Jackson, who had stepped back, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, as if he were waiting for something to unfold. His presence was unsettling, and Marley couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Still, she had no choice. The final pieces of the puzzle were within reach. "I'm not going to ask you again," Lucia said, her voice low but firm. "What are you really after, Jackson?" Jackson smirked but didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the table and picked up a small folder, flipping through the pages. "You'll see for yourself soon enough. But if you're smart, you'll finish this up quickly and get out. You're both in over your heads." Marley's breath caught in her throat. The warning in Jackson's voice was undeniable, but so was the sense of finality that hung in the air. Whatever was about to happen, whatever was in those files, it would change everything. She focused on the screen in front of her, fingers flying across the keyboard as she pulled up the last set of files. The encrypted documents were harder to crack than the others, but with a few key entries, the data started to unravel. And there it was, H. Richter's final report. The files contained everything, the full scope of Project Midnight, its connections to various governments, the black market weapons deals, and most chilling of all, the final plans for the last shipment. The operation had been designed to disappear, to erase all traces of its existence, but Richter's last report was a testament to just how deep the operation had gone. Marley clicked through the pages, her mind whirling as the truth unfolded before her. The files revealed that Richter had been involved in the creation of an underground network that traded in not only weapons but also human trafficking, political influence, and covert military operations. Everything she had uncovered about the project was just a fraction of the monstrous web that had been spun across the globe. She turned to Lucia, her face pale as she spoke the words aloud. "This isn't just about the plane. This was bigger than anyone could have imagined. My father wasn't just involved in aviation. He was involved in all of this." Lucia stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "Your father was a part of something that was never meant to see the light of day. But you're not the only one with blood on their hands now, Marley. You're part of this story, too." Marley's mind reeled, and for a brief moment, the weight of the entire situation threatened to crush her. The world she thought she knew, the life she'd tried so hard to build away from the shadows of her father's legacy, was gone. It had all been a lie. But then something shifted inside her. She wasn't just going to be a bystander in this story. She wouldn't let her father's mistakes define her future. She stood up, her hands trembling but resolute. "No, I'm going to make this right." Lucia looked at her, a mixture of concern and respect in her eyes. "And how do you plan to do that?" Marley's gaze hardened, the fire of determination burning brighter than ever. "I'm going to expose this. I'll bring it all to light, everything Richter did, everything my father was a part of. This doesn't end with them. It ends with me." Lucia studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'm with you. You know where I stand." Jackson, who had been silent, now pushed himself off the wall and approached them. "You think you can walk away from this clean? You think you can just expose the operation and move on? You'll be hunted. All of you. By the same people who put this in motion." Marley looked him straight in the eye. "Let them come. I won't run. I never have." A tense silence settled over the room. Jackson seemed to hesitate, his eyes narrowing, as if measuring her resolve. Finally, he scoffed and turned toward the door. "You're all fools. But that's your choice." The sound of the door shutting behind him echoed through the empty house, leaving Marley and Lucia alone in the quiet aftermath. "I don't know what's going to happen next," Marley said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know this. I'm not running anymore. Not from them, not from my father, not from anything." Lucia stepped beside her, her hand on Marley's shoulder. "Then let's make sure this ends the way it was always supposed to. On your terms." Marley took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. The fight was far from over, and the road ahead would be filled with danger, deception, and uncertainty. But for the first time, she felt in control. For the first time, she wasn't just cleaning up someone else's mess. She was making her own future, one that was hers to build.